Independent report on the history and handling of MOVE victims' remains. In 2021, the City of Philadelphia requested independent reports from Deckard LLP and Montgomery McCracken Walker and Rhodes LLP focused on the city's possession of human remains from the 1985 bombing of the MOVE organization and the policies and procedures of the Medical Examiner's Office. The reports come just over a year after the city announced that it would undertake such a comprehensive investigation. The administration retained two law firms to conduct the investigation, Deckard LLP and Montgomery McCracken Walker and Rhodes LLP MMWR. The investigative process included more than 70 interviews with current and former city employees, MOVE Commission personnel, outside experts, legal counsel, and members of the victims' families. The investigations also involved site visits and an extensive document collection and review from the city's archives, Temple University's Special Collections Research Center, and various funeral homes and cemeteries. Part 1 of the investigation focused on the handling of the MOVE remains from 1985 to the present and an examination of the contemporary evidence related to the remains of MOVE victims that were or are currently at the MIO, including the destruction of toxicology samples from victims in 2009, the discovery of the MIO box in 2017, and the rediscovery of the MIO box in 2021. This portion of the investigation was conducted by Deckard LLP pro bono. Parts 2 and 3 of the investigation, conducted by MMWR, focused on reviewing the policies and practices of the MIO and making recommendations to enhance them through a racial equity lens. This portion of the report also details the MOVE victim remains that were transferred to DRs. Alan Mann and Janet Monge, anthropologists associated with the University of Pennsylvania Penn, and Princeton University, in 1986, that were later discovered to still be in Dr. Monge's possession. I am grateful to our investigative teams from Deckard LLP and Montgomery, McCracken Walker and Rhodes LLP whose dedication and diligent work have contributed much-needed answers to questions that arose last year after the discovery of human remains from MOVE victims still in the city's possession. The tragedy of the MOVE bombing in 1985 and the decades-long trauma it has inflicted on family members, neighbors and city residents is something that we will never completely heal from, said Mayor Jim Kenney. The events of 2021 exposed flaws and shortcomings in city procedures, and the passage of decades since the initial mishandling of the victims' remains compounded the issues we were faced with and had to try and unravel. While I know the reports did not answer every question we have around the remains we found last year, I remain hopeful that we can give some additional comfort and closure to family members after they review the report and we discuss our next steps with them, added Mayor Kenney. Additionally, by examining the policies and procedures of the MIO through a racial equity lens and by consulting with experts from across the country, we will move forward with recommendations on new policies and procedures with an eye towards equity and inclusion. In response to the issues laid out in the report, the Department of Public Health and Medical Examiner's Office issued a response about the progress and feasibility of many of the recommendations. We are grateful to the authors of the reports for their thoroughness and insights and commit to using these findings to improve our processes, the equity with which we do our work, and to win back the trust of the community, said Dr. Cheryl Bettigol, Philadelphia's Health Commissioner. Some of the changes recommended are already in process, while others may be more challenging to implement due to funding or logistical constraints. In addition to the changes recommended by the investigators, we are committed to working with the families of the victims to identify a respectful plan for how to handle the remains and will be reaching out in the near future to initiate those conversations. Two of the report's recommendations are that the MIO to amend the death certificates of all 11 MOVE bombing victims, one updating the cause of death and two reflecting that the manner of death was homicide and not accident. The MIO plans to review and update the death certificates. Philadelphia released an independent report Thursday focused on the city's possession of human remains from the 1985 MOVE bombing and the procedures of the city's medical examiner's office. The city first announced that it would conduct the investigation more than a year ago. While I know the reports did not answer every question we have around the remains we found last year, I remain hopeful that we can give some additional comfort and closure to family members after they review the report and we discuss our next steps with them, Mayor Jim Kenney said in a statement announcing the conclusion of the investigation. Two outside law firms, Deckard LLP and Montgomery McCracken Walker and Rhodes LLP, were tapped to lead the investigation. Deckard's piece of the inquiry dealt with the handling of the human remains from 1985 all the way to the present day. It also examined the contemporary evidence related to the remains, such as the destruction of the toxicology samples from victims in 2009 to the discovery of the medical examiner's office box. MMWR's research analyzed the policies within the MIO and made recommendations from a racial equity lens. The investigation also detailed how some of the remains were transferred to Dr. Alan Mann and Dr. Janet Monge, anthropologists associated with the University of Pennsylvania and Princeton University, in 1986, that were later discovered to still be in Dr. Monge's possession. The combined investigative report, however, emphasized that there were limitations. Because the law firms lacked the ability to compel interview subjects to speak, several key witnesses refused to cooperate even though they knew they were the only source of the information. Regarding the documentation and retrieval of the remains, the probe found numerous inconsistencies and contradictions with MIO files. There were no logs detailing whether remains released by the MIO were received by funeral homes and cemeteries. As a result, we are unable to conclude definitively what remains, if any, were released for the respective victims and actually buried or cremated between May 1985 and September 1986, when the last of the victims' remains were purportedly formally released to the families, the report said. Because of the manner by which the scene was processed and MEO's failure to visit the scene in the aftermath of the bombing, the ability to establish a chain of custody of the remains was doomed from the beginning. In the review of the months and years that followed the bombing, the law firms established a rough timeline of the transfer of human remains. Yet, because a key former MIO pathologist declined to participate, many questions were left unanswered. When the box containing the human remains of MOVE members was found in 2017, an MIO employee notified his supervisors, including then Chief Medical Examiner Sam Gulino, who would then go on to notify former Deputy Commissioner Caroline Johnson and former Health Commissioner Thomas Farley. Farley resigned in 2021 over his involvement in mishandling the remains. According to the investigation, Farley ordered Gulino to retain the remains for 6 months and then have them cremated. Dr. Farley never saw, and never asked to see, the human remains in the MIO box, despite recognizing the significance of the fact that City had in its possession remains that were linked to the MOVE bombing decades after the bombing. He also did not advise his superiors, including the managing director, or the mayor's office, about the presence of the remains in the MIO box, the report said. The box would later be discovered in a cold storage room in May 2021, even though there was apparently a record of its destruction. Although the law firms repeatedly tried to reach out to the city employee tasked with cremating the remains, their requests were denied. Therefore, we do not know why the remains were not cremated, and when, why, or by whom they were brought to the cold storage room in the first instance, the report said. Ultimately, the investigation was unable to determine how long the box had been in that basement storage room before January 2017 and who put it there. Finally, we cannot determine why the remains were kept by the MIO and not returned to next of kin, the report said. Many of the individuals interviewed, including former Mayor W. Wilson Good Sr., MOVE Commission members, and others, expressed shock and disbelief that the city was still in possession of the remains. Even though the city never requested any recommendations as part of the report, the law firms felt that it was appropriate to do so. The firms recommended that there be a concerted, inclusive effort to educate city residents about the MOVE bombing, its victims, and the impact it had on the surrounding community. Additionally, the report calls for a physical commemoration of this historical event. After being unnerved that the 5 child victims of the MOVE bombing were buried in unmarked graves, the investigators believe that there should be a marker or memorial at Eden Cemetery. Lastly, the report asks that whoever is charged with the duty of identifying the remains from the MIO box use the investigation as a springboard. In other words, though we have not formally identified those remains and though such identification is beyond the scope of our engagement, we believe the information contained here will be valuable and relevant to any subsequent analysis, the report said. Among the 16 recommendations for the MIO, 2 are that the MIO amend the death certificates of all 11 MOVE bombing victims to update the cause of death, and reflect that the manner of death was homicide and not accident. The MIO plans to do so. Kinney said that he was grateful for the investigative teams and their work. The tragedy of the MOVE bombing in 1985 and the decades-long trauma it has inflicted on family members, neighbors, and city residents is something that we will never completely heal from, Kinney said. The events of 2021 exposed flaws and shortcomings in city procedures, and the passage of decades since the initial mishandling of the victims' remains compounded the issues we were faced with and had to try and unravel. Philadelphia Health Commissioner Cheryl Bettigold echoed that sentiment in a statement, while also outlining some of the expected hurdles in following through with all of the recommendations. Some of the changes recommended are already in process, while others may be more challenging to implement due to funding or logistical constraints. In addition to the changes recommended by the investigators, we are committed to working with the families of the victims to identify a respectful plan for how to handle the remains and will be reaching out in the near future to initiate those conversations, Bettigold said. The Philadelphia Department of Public Health and the MEO issued a response to the investigation. Philadelphia concludes year-long investigation on mishandling of MOVE bombing victims' remains. After a year-long investigation on the handling of the remains of the 1985 MOVE bombing victims, investigators remain unable to explain how a box of victims' remains managed to lay undetected in cold storage in the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's office for decades after the bombing. In 1985, the Philadelphia city government bombed the residence of the Black liberation advocacy group MOVE, killing 5 children and 6 adults, destroying 61 homes, and displacing 250 residents from the neighborhood. Penn faced criticism last year when it became known that MOVE bombing remains were in the Penn Museum's possession. In a separate controversy, a box of the victims' remains was found in the medical examiner's office last year in May, just days after former Philadelphia Health Commissioner Thomas Farley resigned over his order to cremate the remains without notifying the victims' families. We are getting to the bottom of many different disturbing questions, including why these remains were held for decades, and why they were still held after being directed to be cremated, Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney said in a statement in 2021. To look into the mishandling of the MOVE bombing victims' remains, city officials commissioned investigators from 2 law firms, Deckard LLP in Montgomery, McCracken, Walker, and Rhodes LLP, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported. On June 6, these investigators released a 257-page report of their findings, concluding that the 1985 investigation was grossly inadequate and that the understaffed medical examiner's office is still unable to effectively investigate homicides. According to the report, the medical examiner's office demonstrated negligent practices beginning at the very scene of the bombing. The medical examiner at the time failed to send staff to the scene to ensure the proper recovery of the victims' bodies. Consequently, the extraction process damaged victims' bodies, jeopardizing future forensic investigations and dooming the chain of custody from the beginning. The report states that the medical examiner's office's documents on the victims were incomplete, inconsistent, and, at times, contradictory from the start. Accordingly, investigators were unable to determine what remains, if any, were released to victims' family and actually buried or cremated. In 2017, a staffer at the medical examiner's office found a box labeled MOVE evidence containing bones and bone fragments of unidentified victims. Investigators determined that the victims' families should have been notified immediately after the bone fragments were found. Instead, then medical examiner Sam Gulino and Farley decided to cremate the remains following a waiting period of 6 months to ensure that the bones' existence would not become widely known. However, without Farley's knowledge, an employee disregarded Farley's order to cremate the remains. The box was found intact in 2021. The reasons behind the employee's decision remain unknown as they, among several other former employees, have refused to speak to the investigators. Though they lack some information from key witnesses, investigators hope that the information they found will serve as a foundation for any future analysis. The report lays out 16 recommendations to the medical examiner's office, which the Philadelphia Department of Public Health has accepted. One of these recommendations is to change the bombing victims' death certificates to reflect that the cause of their deaths was homicide, not accidents. The report also highlights the need to educate city residents on the deadly MOVE bombing, which remains relatively unknown to those outside Philadelphia and younger city residents. Finally, the report calls for improved practices at the medical examiner's office, including more cultural diversity training. Though the report does not explicitly blame racism for the mishandling of victims' remains, it does state that it is difficult to believe that all of the omissions and commissions discussed above were made simply through negligence. Some of the changes recommended are already in process. Some will be challenging due to funding constraints, Philadelphia Health Commissioner Cheryl Bettigold said. In addition to the changes recommended by the investigators, we are committed to working with the families of the victims to identify a respectful plan for how to handle the remains.
It's considered one of Philadelphia's darkest days. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the Move bombing, an eviction standoff with police that came to a deadly end May 13th, 1985, with the city dropping a bomb on a house. 11 people, including 5 children, died. Mothers of those children are speaking out following the recent revelation that bones from the bombing site ended up in the hands of a professor from the Penn Museum.
Today, the women talked with NBC 10's Rosemary Connors about where the remains are now and to reflect on the lives they lost.
My son was Phil, Africa. He was 11 years old. He was murdered May 13th, 1985.
Tommaso, Africa, 8 years old.
Delisha, 13 years old.
Patricia, Africa, 13 years old. Zanetta, Africa, 11 years old. Murdered May 13th, 1985.
It will be 36 years ago tomorrow. The bombing ordered by the city of Philadelphia targeted the revolutionary group MOVE and killed 6 adults along with 5 children. The children of these women who were in prison at the time of the bombing and never saw their kids again. Now they've learned decades ago the city medical examiner gave human remains from the bombing site to Penn Museum for identification. There are reports the remains could be those of Janet Africa's daughter Delisha and Consuela Africa's daughter Patricia, but the women are not convinced.
I got family members who told me that they buried my children. Now, 36 years later, they talk about they got bones.
What do you believe? What do you believe? I mean, her brother told her that they buried her children. So now, who do they have there?
The museum has since apologized to the women after tracking down the remains, and Penn is investigating.
I don't appreciate, we don't like the fact that these people done what they did and then dictating to us what they're going to do with them.
The women say Penn Museum reached out about a week ago to tell them that they gave the remains to a funeral home in Philadelphia. But the women say that wasn't their choice, and they don't know how they want to proceed just yet.
We're still meeting as an organization, as a family, making a decision. But you have to understand our suspicion and reluctance.
The women tell me they don't trust that these remains are in fact their loved ones, given what happened to their children 36 years ago.
This is something that you would never imagine. I mean, dropping a bomb in a city.
It's part of Philadelphia's dark past these women live with every day. I'm Rosemary Connors, NBC 10 News.
As you leave the page, don't forget to hit the like bell and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so as yet. Thank you for watching.